So as people are still coming in, so first, welcome everybody to this webinar on the Safe Landing Climates Lighthouse activity, understanding high-risk events. So this is a webinar in a series that we're having on cascading impacts. And the goal of this lighthouse activity is to identify risks from low probability, high impact events, and then also try to understand what are the knowledge gaps, what are unexpected risks that we might not be able to anticipate because of current limitations, and how can we better incorporate some of these risks into future projections. And so the webinars are covering a series of different sectors. Today we're focusing on climate risks to ecosystems, and we start with a talk by Thomas Pugh on climate risks to tree mortality from climate change. Then we move on to attribution with Chantelle Burton, and then Kirsten Thonicke on mechanisms of resilience and what to expect in the future. So each speaker will have about 20 minutes, and then we will wait for the questions to the end so that we can get the full perspective on the different topics that are being covered. But please go ahead and type your questions in the Q&A chat, and then we will address them at the end of the three talks. So with that, I would like to first invite Thomas Pugh, who's a senior lecturer in Lund University and also a reader in Birmingham University. He's interested on biosphere-climate interactions, and he's been working on terrestrial biosphere modeling and tree mortality. So welcome, Tom. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Anna, for the introduction and the invite. And of course, everybody else for coming along. Just bear with me while I share my screen. Of course, the meeting controls are in the way. There we go. Yeah, great. So I also have to thank all the people on this slide, and actually many more, because the things I'm going to show to you today, of course, mostly not done directly by me. So yeah, I've been asked to talk about risks of tree mortality under climate change, and I'm going to do that from a very much modeling perspective. And I think a good place to start then is maybe we could start with what kills trees. This is a topic that we could talk about endlessly on an almost philosophical level. But I think we could kind of boil it down into some general groups, which is what I want to do here. So here you've got a beautiful picture of a spruce stand in Sweden. And how might those trees die? Well, they could die because of extrinsic stresses, by which I mean something that's kind of imposed on those trees very much from the outside. So we can think of this as a drought with a lack of water, or a high vapor pressure deficit that imposes stresses on those trees. They could also die because of the way that they compete with each other. And so just the competition between the trees for light, for water, for nitrogen, or so on, poses stress and causes death. They could die because somebody comes along with a chainsaw and chops them down. Some people don't consider that death. They call it just harvest, but that's another philosophical topic we could get into, but won't. But they can also die in kind of large disturbance events. And I would also categorize these a bit separately. So things like fires, which Chantelle will talk about later, windstorms, big bark beetle outbreaks, and so on. So we have these different ways that the trees can die. And of course, climate change acts on these in different ways, and also other parts of the system. And that means that changes in these mortality rates could lead to new ecosystems. And so maybe we can just start here, just briefly, beginning this talk, going through what that might look like. So it might look like a change in ecosystem state. So here we just have a conceptual plot of biomass with time, and we have our spruce hanging out quite nicely. Then climate change starts, and they're not quite so happy. And the biomass declines simply because mortality rates have increased. But they somehow, climate change, maybe if we're really lucky, stabilizes out, and also in this case, the biomass of this plantation is stabilizing out. So they've changed their state. They've got less biomass, but it's the same basic ecosystem there. But of course, we could have a transition to another ecosystem, right? So we could have our spruce species, spruce trees hanging out quite nicely. Climate change starts, they're still pretty okay. And then suddenly we have some big transition where they die off pretty quickly. And the bark beetle outbreaks we see in Central Europe right now would be an example of this. And then perhaps another species is coming through and leading to a new ecosystem type. So a complete change in composition as well as the state. And that can happen really quickly. It can also happen quite slowly without any big dramatic events, just an increase in that background mortality rate, which causes this first species to kind of gradually die out and be replaced. And it can also really happen really much slower even than that, because perhaps that those existing trees, they actually can continue to exist under this new climate, but they're not establishing anymore. And so we have this establishment failure. We don't have replacement of these trees as they die, but they hang out doing their thing until they reach the end of their natural lifespan. And that delays this new species coming through. So we have a whole range of different ways that the ecosystem might respond to changes in these mortality rates. And we know that things like this are happening, right? At least in the first stages. I mean, this is a plot that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with from about 10 years ago, describing tree mortality rates in the Amazon and showing that they've increased over time. So we have these kind of long-term increases in mortality happening in different parts of the world. And kind of the big question here, like the million-dollar question is, well, is this going to lead to just a state change in the ecosystem, or is it going to lead to a transition? Certainly, we know that it is leading to some changes in composition. But of course, you know, nature's never as nice and friendly and straightforward as those examples. So here I wanted to just show an example of some work. It's now in press, which I think demonstrates that complexity quite nicely. What Julian here has been doing is looking, this is purely based on observations of trees from ground-based inventories. And he's looked at their abundances of many different species across their ranges and how that's changing. And what he's found is that basically on the cold and wet ends of their ranges, generally species are doing better than on the warm and dry. About 2/3 of all the species we looked at in Europe and North America, they're doing better on the cold and wet ends of their ranges. But about 1/3 are actually doing the opposite. So, you know, we'd expect with climate change, we're going to have species pushed up to more northerly or higher elevations. But actually, in the data here, we're seeing something a bit different. And, you know, there's a whole range of reasons that could be, but one possibility, of course, is that maybe some of their competitors have been more strongly affected and they're actually benefiting from competition release, for example. We don't know, we're just hypothesizing, but it's certainly a very complex picture that we have to deal with here. So the challenge for modelers is then, well, we actually want to make some useful projections of what we think is going to happen in terms of climate risks and in terms of tree mortality, but what that's going to mean for the ecosystems. And well, I wish I could give you lots of answers here, but I'm only going to give you some first steps. But just to have us all on the same page, you know, what do I mean when I talk about modeling? What kind of model? What the models that I'm going to talk about now, the model is a dynamic vegetation model, and the results I'm going to show you from the model that we work with is called LPJGuess. And this model, like other models in its class, we're starting from individual trees or even leaves and scaling those up to the landscape, like you see here on the left, and then from there up to continents or even the globe. And most of the examples I'll show you today will be more continental scale than global scale, but it's all the same model and the same principles. And the thing about these models is that historically, they haven't been very good at projecting tree mortality. So this is an comparison of different models we did. The simulations are now actually about 10 years old. And we just ran them out into the future under strong climate change and asked, what do they do in terms of carbon turnover times with respect to tree mortality. And you can see here that the results span zero. You know, they're all over the place. And the reasons are very good, is that when these models were put together a few decades ago, we didn't have much information on tree mortality. So they're all full of mechanisms that make a lot of sense, but often they don't have the full power of modern data behind them, or they're missing a mechanism that we now know is important. So a challenge in our community over the last decade or so has been really trying to improve the way that these models are simulating tree mortality. And today I'm just going to go through 4 aspects, and I'm going to go through them pretty quickly just because I want to give you a flavor of what's going on and some of the first results from that. So I'm going to look at stress mortality, stand dynamics, a bit on disturbances, and something that seems very simple, but actually is surprisingly difficult, which is starting the models in the right place. Okay. So starting with stress mortality. And here I want to show you some work that's been carried out by Philip Papastefanou when he was in the group of Anja Ramig in Munich. And he took the LPJ gas model and put in a much more detailed description of how the trees respond to water stress and how that then propagates into mortality. And what he also did was consider how different trees have different strategies, and particularly different vulnerabilities to drought stress. I'm not going to go into the details of that setup, but I want to kind of jump straight into some results. And he applied it to look at the Amazon forest over the last decades. And what you see on screen now, this is the 2005 Amazon drought. So on the left, that's the cumulative water deficit. So if it's more red, that means there was drier conditions in the period during drought, at least according to this climate data set. And on the right, you see our standard version of the LPJGS model without his developments. And this is then the change in biomass that the model simulates just following that drought period. And now I flick forward to the new version, which has the plant, the hydraulics, the water stress description included. And now you can see that actually the model is picking out biomass reductions that link to the stress that's in the climate data set. And this is then really cool, a really nice step forward. And what's also really nice is then when he plots out the change in mortality rates over the period and compares it to the observations. So this is the same observations I showed you from the Breen et al. Paper just a few slides back. Actually, the model and the observations agree really well, actually a bit scarily well, but still they agree really nicely. And he's done a lot of work here to kind of bottom out that the response in terms of mortality makes sense compared to other observations at different scales. So this is a really cool, exciting result, because what it means is we can take these observations where we can definitively see an increase in mortality rate, but we don't know the cause, and now we can attribute that cause from first principles to actually being down to water stress using this modeling approach. And of course, this opens up new opportunities for the future as well to look at future scenarios. There is a big challenge there, though, and that is that different trees have different strategies for dealing with water stress. Some of them have more kind of risk-taking responses, and some of them are more conservative in their responses. And then if this varies systematically across forests and geographically, then we're going to have very different responses in different parts of the world. So what you see on screen here, this is now purely observation driven. It's a combination of forest inventory and trait information. And we tried to map what kind of strategies were manifesting in different parts of the temperate forest. And basically the top is this more risk-taking or more conservative? And the bottom is about the stomatal strategy. But what I want you to take away from this plot is that you can see big coherent patterns here. So really different strategies that dominate in different parts of the forest. And one of our big challenges is that we need to represent these in modeling. And this goes far beyond the traditional kind of plant functional type approach of, is it a needle-leaf or broadleaf? Is it a deciduous or evergreen that's traditionally been adopted in large-scale models? Okay, jumping on quickly. So not all trees, of course, die from drought stress. There's plenty of ways they can die, as we dealt with on the first slide. And we're trying to, in this work I'm showing you now, we're trying to put a stronger empirical basis behind some of these mechanisms that are just related to the carbon balance of the tree. And what we've been doing here is we've taken forest inventory data, so remeasured individual trees. In this case, in Europe, it's about 2 million trees behind this this work, and quite a lot of people measuring them actually. And we look at, well, how does the probability of death vary, for instance, relative to the growth rate of those trees or the size of those trees or some other aspects. And Adrian and Philip here, what they did is they trained a deep neural network on that information and implemented that in LPJ-GESS. And then we have this quite flexible data-driven approach with lots of empirical force behind it to try and simulate the effects of tree mortality in the model. And what you see now on this plot on the right, well, on the y-axis, it's the mortality probability, and on the x-axis, it's the biomass of the tree. The blue is the observations, the orange is the standard LPJ-GESS, which isn't, in this case, for this species, doing a great job in its vanilla version. But when we include this deep neural network mortality now, you can see that the model and observations are actually pretty close to each other. And I think that given that this model is trained on observations, this DNN model is trained on observations, and then it's put in a dynamic model, which has its own biases with growth and so on, the fact that it didn't just explode is pretty exciting, actually, and opens up some, hopefully some quite cool opportunities for applying this. It's not all rosy. We have a lack of data for big trees in this European data set. And that really manifests when we look into long-term predictions of what's going to happen. So this is just some regrowth curves here for oak. And what you can see on the standard model on the left, it's biomass on the y-axis, and it just, have a nice increase. So trees are getting about 200 years old, and then they start to die a bit, but we have these nice curves. And on the neural network on the right, well, it's a bit more varied, but that's good. We want some stochasticity. But up to about 100, 150 years, it's doing stuff that's quite sensible. But then it goes a bit mad, and the biomasses just get really too high. And I think this is primarily simply because we're lacking data there. So there's some limitations, but there are also some quite exciting possibilities here. Quickly moving on. Another thing I want to look at is competition. And basically, so higher productivity due to, for instance, carbon dioxide, higher growth rates means more competition, and this means more mortality. This is really well established in classical work going back many decades. So this is what you see here is a plot of self-thinning, so plant density versus the average size of those plants, and basically we have this very well established slope of -1.5. So in time, you have a stand of trees, it's moving up this curve from bottom right to top left, and you're getting bigger but less trees. And what this means is, you grow quicker, you move along this curve more quickly, your mortality rates must increase. And we can simulate this in our models and look at the effect, and that's what we see here. We have here two simulations, one with fixed carbon dioxide. This is all the world's forests just pooled together. Fixed carbon dioxide in blue, so no change in mortality rate over time. I didn't include climate change here. And then we had one with transient carbon dioxide. So it's basically just giving the model a growth increase, a realistic growth increase. And you can see here that the mortality rate in carbon terms increased by 7% per year. The mortality rate in stem terms, stem mortality rate increased by 40%. So you can have really big increases in mortality rate that you can observe in the field, perhaps, but may not be because of kind of these extrinsic stress kind of mortality, but rather competition generated by increased productivity. And you have to be a bit careful with attribution. And I'll give an example of that from Central Europe. Here is a plot of canopy mortality in Central Europe over the last decades. This comes from satellite, so you can see that in the study, what Cornelius Senn showed is we have this increase in canopy mortality over time. And we thought, well, can we model that and try and understand what's driving it? And in this work that Marika published a couple of years ago, we see that actually, well, we can replicate that trend, but actually we don't need to invoke these extrinsic kind of climate stresses to do that. Actually, just the fact that the trees are more productive and were then harvested sooner because they reached the appropriate size sooner was able to capture this trend. Now, this is up to about 2015. You take the last 10 years, of course, I think you see a very different picture with the big disturbances in Europe right now, but still, going back a few years, a lot of this trend could well be explained by productivity. Talking of disturbances, moving on to this final example, so I'm just going through very quickly, but of course we can discuss later if you have questions. Disturbances are really, a tricky thing to model historically. They're, big events that affect often a large patch of forest, and they happen very rarely. But when they do, they have a large effect. And this is a challenging thing to model. What we've been doing to approach this is we just split the problem into two components: the hazard, so the likelihood of having environmental conditions which cause disturbance, and this may change, but it's storm frequency, for instance, and the vulnerability of the forest, which is based on its current state. And then here's some work led by Cornelis and Frederick. So what we have here is the hazard that Cornelis put together from the European storm, the Copernicus storm database. So this is the likelihood of a severe storm occurring in a particular location. And then we have in the center simulations that Frederick's done that calculate the forest state across that domain, so the biomass, the height, the species, and so on. And from that, we're able to calculate the vulnerability, so the wood that we think would be damaged in a severe storm based on our modeling approach. And we combine these hazard and vulnerability components together, and we get this annual loss of wood due to storms, which we're still in the process of evaluating. But it's now quite exciting that we have an approach to deal with this. And this is also not the only approach out there. There's also work by the Orchidea group, who have had a storm damage model for a few years. So now we're starting to have some models that can look at these disturbances at continental scale and explore their effects. And that's really a big step forward. But this brings me to my last point. So structure. So a lot of this hazard, this vulnerability is about, what state the forest is in. And traditionally, these kind of dynamic models, we don't initialize their state. We let them dynamically spin up to what they think is a representation of what the forest should be, based on its history. And often that ends up with a forest state that's quite different from reality. And if you're thinking about the effects of disturbances or really almost any tree mortality effect, if you look at that forest on the left, model forest on the left, it's not equivalent in mortality terms to any of the four forests on the right. So it's really important that we get this structure correct. Now I give you a concrete example worked through with our model here. So on the left, this is vegetation biomass calculated from potential natural vegetation. So just the model doing its dynamic thing to get to the starting point. And on the right, we initialize that model with information on the age of the different stands. And you see you get quite a different biomass come through. That's not a big shock. But it also plays through very strongly into those predictions of storm damage. So on the left, we have a very different storm damage probability to the one on the right. This is really the dominant factor in simulating the effects of those disturbances. So with that, I want to wrap up. So I think this is actually a really exciting time to be working with these models. We're getting close to being able to realistically model these mortality changes and explore their impacts. Still lots to do. We have some big challenges with scaling plant strategies. Much of the work I've shown you for Europe, for instance, has been based on species level. And if we go global, we have to really put those together in sensible strategic groupings. But trying to do any of this without having proper representation of demography and composition, I don't think that's going to work. And kind of finish with a much more general message. I think, our forests are always been in flux, and now they're even more in flux than they have been in recent times, and we just need to reconcile ourselves to that fact that they are changing, and do our best to come up with ways to help ease those transitions with management. And with that, I'll thank you and stop.
Thank you very much, Tom. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we will collect the questions in the Q&A. So please start typing your questions for Tom right now. And we will follow with Chantelle Burton, who is a senior climate science at the Met Office Hadley Center, and she's involved in the coordination of fire MIP. She works with the fire model Inferno in Jules, which is part of UKESM. And she's interested in the effects of fire on vegetation and the carbon cycle. So welcome, Chantelle, and we look forward to your talk.
Thanks. Hopefully you can see that in full screen right now.
Not yet. We see the normal PowerPoint.
Okay. Let me try again. How about now?
No, we still see the...
Okay. Okay, hopefully that's got it.
No, you were sharing your screen in the training. Maybe, I don't know, it's like your desktop, so maybe that would work.
Is that okay?
No,
but
maybe...
I think you should click on the slideshow icon on the orange ribbon on top. So that will maximize the slide on the screen.
I think for sure, Chantelle, you see the full screen, I guess.
Yeah, it's working for me fine. Yeah, maybe I'll just share the screen then.
Yeah, exactly. That was working. So that, yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Okay, so yeah, I'm Chantelle Burton. I'm based at the Met Office in the UK, and I'm going to be talking about different approaches to fire attribution. So I wanted to start by thinking about what kind of tools we have to look at trying to address this question of how climate change is affecting fires globally. So this image here is from the Carbon Brief, and it shows a number of fire attributions in the literature, fire attribution studies across the literature over the last few decades, and each point represents geographically where the fire attribution study is focusing on. So you can see it's very widely distributed across the world, and each icon here represents a different type of attribution or event that's trying to be attributed here, so that there's many types of attribution studies covering heat waves, flooding, drought, storms, cold, snow and ice, and fire. But what you can see is if we take away all of these other types of attribution studies and we just look at fire, there are actually very few attribution studies that specifically focus on fire. And I think there are a few reasons for this. So I think firstly, fire is quite a complicated thing to try and break down and attribute to climate change. There are multiple contributing factors to fire that you don't get, for example, with a heat wave where you're just trying to look at one variable like temperature, for example. With fire, you've got multiple meteorological drivers like temperature, precipitation, soil moisture, wind, lightning, but you've also got the human element to fires, which is really difficult to represent in models. So human factors of ignition, suppression, which you can't always account for. There's an element of stochasticity and randomness in that as well as changes in land use due to humans, which affect the fuel load. So that's part of the reason, I think, also because it's quite a new area. So I had a look at the literature a few years ago and tried to look at the number of fire attribution studies out there. And you can see from the plot on the left, it's a few years out of date now, so there's probably a few more. But it's really only the last few years where people have started trying to approach this question. And we're getting more attribution studies coming around now focusing on fire, but really it's quite a new field that's developing over time. So people are starting to branch out from the original attribution studies that just focused on heat waves, for example, and trying to look more broadly across a range of impacts, including fire. So I think there are also reflecting this complexity in trying to model fire. There are a number of different approaches that people have tried to employ to try and answer this question around how climate change is driving fire. So for example, the plot on the right-hand side shows a number of studies that have used different applications or different representations of fire. So for example, a few actually try to look at burned area, but others feel that it's perhaps too complicated to try and focus on all of the elements of fire. So they use a proxy like a fire weather index, for example, or a drought index like the evaporative demand drought index or the Keach biome drought index, or they look at a proxy like vapor pressure deficit can be a good proxy for fire weather, or even splitting it down into individual variables like attributing temperature or precipitation separately rather than trying to put that into a fire index. So there are lots of different approaches to try and tackle this question, reflecting the complexity, I think, of fire as an impact and the newness of the field. So in addition to trying to use different approaches to look at fire, there are a number of different approaches to attribution as well, which I wanted to go over. So you may be familiar with event attribution. So this is often an approach where a single extreme weather event is being looked at. For example, a heat wave has been looked at quite regularly in the literature. Here, often you're considering a single event, you're using one climate model, but a large ensemble of that climate model. So you've got different realizations of the weather. Your uncertainty therefore comes from natural variability. And the question that you're trying to answer is around what's the change in probability or magnitude of a specific extreme event due to anthropogenic forcing. So separate to that, we've got trend attribution. So here, the difference is we're looking over the longer term historical period or future period even. And we're looking at changes in the simulation across normally multiple global climate models, GCMs. So here your uncertainty comes from model uncertainty. And the kind of questions you might ask with this approach are like, what's the long-term trend in how a climate system responds to changes in radiative forcing? So each of these two approaches align more with IPCC Working Group 1, whereas more recent development that aligns more with IPCC Working Group 2 is impact attribution. So I've been working quite a bit in this area alongside EasyMIP, which is the intersectoral impacts intercomparison project. And the idea here is that you're looking at a change in an impact, for example, fire. It could be fire, but it could be other things like groundwater, fisheries, agriculture. But you're looking at the change in that impact due to climate change. So you're not trying to attribute where the cause of that climate change comes from. You're just saying, what is the change in this impact when we look over the historical period at how the climate has been changing. So I wanted to give a few examples of each of these by introducing an exciting new report that I've been working on with Matt Jones from UEA, Doug Kelly at CEH, and Francesca Di Giuseppe at ECMWF, and many more people as well. So this is a report that we're hoping to submit by the end of this month, focusing on wildfires across 2023 and early 2024, covering what we're looking at any sort of anomalous fires that occurred over the last year, looking at the data to how unusual they were, picking out a number of case studies from last year. For example, you may remember the Canada wildfires last year, Greece and South America were very unusual events. So we're trying to look at those events and look at what might have driven them in terms of unusual meteorology or changes in fuel loads. Also look at how future projections for fires might change as a result of climate change. And we've got a section in the report looking at attribution. So this is the section that I wanted to talk about today. And we've got 3 different approaches, a couple that I mentioned earlier on. So looking at fire weather to anthropogenic forcing, looking at stream fires in terms of a sort of impact attribution approach. So I'll go through each one of those in a bit more detail. So the first approach that we're looking at is trying to isolate the meteorological factors that promote wildfires, and asking the question if we can attribute those to human influence. So this is more the event attribution definition. Here we're using fire weather index, so the Canadian FWI, which uses daily temperature, precipitation, humidity, and wind speed. And we're using the HADGEM 3A model, which has 525 members, different realizations of the climate, with 2 different simulations. So we've got a simulation that has only natural forcing from solar variability and volcanic activity. And then alongside that, we've got a simulation that mirrors historical forcing, so including the natural forcing, but also human emissions of greenhouse gases. So in this case, we can actually isolate the changes in fire weather due to anthropogenic forcing that has been put into the climate over the historical period. So we start by evaluating the model. So the plots on the right-hand side here, we're looking at the Canada wildfire event from last year. We're looking at the 95th percentile of fire weather, so really trying to target the extreme end of that. And in subplot A, so the top left, for example, we're looking over the historical period from 1960 to 2013 in the HADGEM ensemble in yellow compared to the observed fire weather created by ERA 5 reanalysis data. And you can see that there's quite a bit of overlap between the 2, but the HADGEM ensemble is biased slightly high in terms of the fire weather compared to ERA 5. So what we do is actually apply a bias correction using simple linear regression to align those more closely and make sure that we have confidence in our model in the historical period before we start applying it to the event from 2023. So that's panel B, where we've applied this correction. They align the probability distributions from the model and ERA 5 align much better in this case, and the same with the time series plot as shown in C. And so we've got this bias correction. We've got 15 historical members to get this this trend from, and we apply that to each of the 525 present day members. So we end up with a very large ensemble of nearly 8,000 members to create our probability ratio of how the probability of the event changes under all forcing versus natural only forcing. And we bootstrap this as well to get an uncertainty range. So some of the results. We've looked at 3 different case studies, like I mentioned. So the Canada wildfires peaked in June last year, the Greece wildfires in August, and then South America across September, October last year. And we find in each of these cases that the probability of the 2023 wildfires occurring is much higher under the all-forcing scenario. So when we model anthropogenic emissions, we find that there's an increase in probability of that 2023 event, which you can see in the black line, which is ERA 5 2023. In Canada, it's almost doubled the likelihood of it experiencing an event like 2023, but in South America, the probability is much higher. So we've got a much greater increase in likelihood of experiencing high fire weather due to human influence. The second approach we've got is looking at impact attribution. So here we're aligning with EasyMIT simulations, where we've got 2 different simulations. We've got a factual, which is driven by reanalysis across the historical periods, versus a counterfactual, which is a detrended version of that reanalysis, which you can see in the blue versus the orange lines on the right-hand side. So the questions that we can answer with this approach are, can we attribute changes and impacts to climate change by looking at the present day factual versus counterfactual? Can we attribute changes to direct human forcing? So in this case, we've only got changes in land use and population density across the counterfactual simulation because we've detrended it, so we don't have that climate signal in there. And by looking at the change in the early industrial in the counterfactual to the present day in the factual, we can say what is the change in impact due to all of those forcings together. So that's the approach that we're using, introduced by Mengele et al. And the first tool that we apply this to is ConFire. So this is developed by Doug Kelly to look at the likelihood of causes or changes in burned area. So in this case, we're trying to look at the whole simulation of burned area, not just fire weather, but also trying to model changes in fuel and ignitions. This is a semi-empirical process representation using Bayes' theorem. So we end up with a probability distribution of how burned area has changed as a result of factual versus counterfactual, and we can apply a statistical likelihood to those changes. And the fire controls that go into the model include fuel moisture, ignition, and suppression, and it's been trained on MODIS burned area data. So again, in each case, we can see an increase in the impact of burned area for Canada, Greece, and Western Amazonia, but a likelihood that direct human forcing or land use change and population, for example, is offsetting some of that change due to climate change. And I'll just give one final example, which is using the impact attribution approach again, but this time we're using 7 models from across FireMIP. So these are similar to the models that Tom mentioned in his talk. They're dynamic vegetation models, but they've got fire enabled. So actually we can model the feedbacks between fire and vegetation. We can try and model ignitions and how that changes burned area. And what we do here is we take a relative anomaly of burned area. We weigh the models across our ensemble of FireMIP models based on their regional performance against observations. And in this case, we're focusing on average burned area rather than the extremes. So on the right-hand side, we've got plots showing how the change in burned area has changed as a result of the forcing in the factual versus the counterfactual simulation. And these are IPCC regions, so 2 regions across Canada in the top 2 plots. And we can't see too much of a signal here, but actually we see much more of a change in the Mediterranean region in the bottom left, for example. So we're seeing much more of a change in average burned area due to climate change in the present day periods in the Mediterranean. So I'll finish there and summarize by saying there's many different approaches to fire attribution. It's probably because it's quite a challenging area to address. So trying to just answer a straightforward question, is fire changing due to climate change? It is not that easy because what do you mean by climate change? There's lots of different approaches to answer the question. And there's lots of different contributing factors to fire as well, which mean that it's quite a complicated, challenging area of research. But it's early days and it's really exciting to see many more studies coming about trying to answer this question. I've also talked about the State of Wildfire report that we're working on this year, so watch out for that. It's going to be very exciting, hopefully coming out later this year, and something that we're going to be repeating annually in years to come. So yeah, I hope that's given a flavour of the different tools that we have available for fire attribution, and it would be great to discuss those further here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Chantelle. Really exciting developments. I agree. So please leave your questions for Chantelle. There's some of them already in the chat, and you know the speakers can also answer some of the questions already if they want, or leave them for the discussion later. So next we have Kirsten Thonicke, who is the Deputy Head of the Research Department on Earth System Analysis and Working Group Leader on Ecosystem and Transitions of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Potsdam. And well, Kirsten works in many things. Climate, land use change, effects on ecosystems, fires, and biodiversity. And well, she will give us a flavor of some of these things today. So welcome, Kirsten. We look forward to your talk.
Yeah, thank you, Anna, for the introduction. And I think the screen sharing works okay, does it? Yeah, okay, great.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, so I will present work that is, closing the circle very nicely with the opening stuff that Tom Pugh showed. So I'm going to talk about structural and functional diversity and how this can contribute to ecosystem resilience. But also we learned that climate change sets its limits. So the work I'm presenting is actually teamwork with my group. Above all, Mike Billing, Boris Zakrzewski, and also including Werner von Bloh, of course, Sarah Beresville and Jamil Priesner, and we work with Ana Bastos from the University of Potsdam. Biodiversity and forest resilience, we have all experienced quite a number of mega drought events. Here, some pictures from Europe, from the bark beetle eating its way through the Harz Mountains, or storm events. And so we realized that climate change already accelerates disturbance. In this case, these were monoculture forests or overaged old forests that were once managed. There's an assumption diverse forests are more resilient, but the question arises, can this assumption actually hold under climate change, and what would be the limits? And also, can we understand the mechanisms why a diverse forest is more resilient? So here, like Tom already showed, simulation models can help to understand complex interactions. And in the two examples that I showed you in my talk today are coming from Europe, so simulating potential natural vegetation in Europe. And so the model that we use is biodiversity subversion of the LPJML dynamic low vegetation model. We include functional diversity in a way that we implement a plant economic spectrum and combine it with gap dynamics to simulate the forest growth model. So in the animation here, what you see is trees of different plant functional types competing with each other for light and water. The coloring of the canopy shows that they have a different specific leaf area, and also they differ in wood density. And connected to those two traits are other functional traits that determine their productivity and so the whole performance in the forest patch. So when trees die because of several reasons, underperforming trees, they disappear from this animation. But it allows us also to follow how we can connect this to ecosystem function like carbon sequestration, carbon storage, but also water evaporation, and so how it interacts with climate. But the question is how it actually interacts with stability. So in a first study, what we did, we asked ourselves, so, okay, what is actually important for tree survival? And connected to it, under climate change, would the important biodiversity factors retain their importance? Or will they be changed in the biodiversity relationships that we know today? In doing so, Mike Billing in my group took an approach where he looked at individual functional traits. So needle-leaf trees versus broadleaf trees, they differ in their SLA value and the wood density. There might also be trees that differ in tree height. So this would be an example for structural diversity, but also the whole natural forest dynamics, which can be expressed also or tracked by the number of trees that the model simulates. But then we can also look at the entire forest patch and compute the functional diversity indices. Here we take the trait combination that every tree individual has in this simulated patch, which you see here in the 3D figure, where each point in this trait space is a tree that has this combination of wood density, leaf longevity, and the specific leaf area. And the coloring of these point clouds illustrate a different plant functional type. So you see many tree individuals that belong to a specific plant functional type. So we overcome this average individual monoculture. But then, okay, looking at these different indices, the question was, okay, what are the determinants or what is their relative importance for tree survival? That doing this produces lots of data. And so Mike decided that applying machine learning to simulate the data would be the way to go. So what he did in his study design, he simulated throughout the 21st century the tree growth embedded in the vegetation dynamics under climate change for different sites and also under different climate scenarios. He tracked the data on the tree survival, put it to a random forest model, and was then able to plot the partial dependence plot to see if a certain factor for a range of a value has a positive influence on the survival, here colored in blue, or the negative influence on survival, then here colored in red. But the most important one is that he could quantify the variable importance plot specifically for functional diversity, forest dynamics, or the individual functional traits. So we did this for 4 sites in what are the last remaining areas of quasi-natural vegetation in Europe. So that's the German site Hainich, the Polish Natural Forest Białowieża, the Legan National Park in Switzerland, and Kalkalpen. So we have a mix of broadleaf deciduous forest, mixed forest in the mountains, and more needle-leaf dominated forest. One must note is that In our simulation world, we have the influence of the mountains indirectly via the climate information. So any particular spatially explicit effect of slope or elevation or soil depth is not yet considered. Okay, so, but we thought the results that I will show you will be using the example of the Degen National Park. And so by looking at the relative importance for tree survival, so a tree that was present when we started the climate change simulation, was it there at the end of the century? And if it was, what was actually the importance of the variable that ensured its survival? And so we found that forest dynamics as such is quite important and remains important under the RCP 4.5. The importance of functional diversity, however, is reduced, and the importance of individual functional traits increases. So we found that a bit puzzling. And so we looked at actually at the point what is happening also in terms of the trait shifts. And what we found is that for the deciduous trees, so this would be let me use a pointer. This would be this range of the SLA, or I can also show it. Yeah, I can mark it here so you see it. This would be the trait range of the deciduous trees. They increased in dominance at the end of the century. The needle-leaf trees decreased, but also shifted a bit in their dominance, and there was a space opening, a trade space opening for intermediate strategies to establish. So we can conclude from this exercise that the large portfolio is important, but we were a bit puzzled why functional diversity decreased and why individual functional traits increased actually. This was the picture for considering the entire forest depth. And then Mike had the idea to say, okay, let us differentiate the picture and look at trees from the understory that are 5 to 10 meters high versus those that are up in the canopy. And so here we found that the importance is mainly driven by the understory trees, and it further reduces for the canopy trees. And so here it is even more important to have the correct individual functional traits for the local adaptation to the climate. So this is a bit of head scratching, and but it makes sense because the competition is high or can be high in the understory. So it's good if there is a diverse understory where different ecological niches can be occupied. And then through the mechanisms of competition and coexistence, then the locally adapted winners make it through to the canopy, and then they have their occupied space with their trait combination. And so they are performing very well, and that's why their individual trait combination is so important for their survival, and the functional diversity is of less importance. So trees have a 15% higher probability to survive if they grow in a functionally diverse forest. We found that quite interesting because it means that functional diverse understories can help European forests to survive. So this sounds more like a very theoretical study with natural forest and not considering the forestry history like Tom Pugh was showing. But it's something that can apply to the management of natural forest in national parks, for example, with those sites are in protected areas. So it does have some implication where we say, okay, maybe we can take more of the observation pattern here. And we have also checked that it is the same importance of the same in a similar pattern also under higher global warming like RCP 8.5. In the second study, we then said, okay, now that we know that diversity is important for the understory, how do forests actually adapt? Because still, if you think of different management scenarios, you could think of testing different forest compositions for the climate resilience. So people think of, if we, wait a sec, no laser pointer, no, I want to start this. Yeah, people think about, there's a lot of discussion on nature restoration, how we can restructure forests to be more natural, how can we bring in the climate resilient forest composition, especially here in Germany. There's a huge discussion after a couple of years of severe droughts in Central Europe, where we found that tree species perform very differently. Species that where we thought they would be quite resilient to drought were not so performing. So all this is actually putting a question of what could be an ideal forest of the future. So what we did is to design a study where we could test different levels of diversity. And so migrate the model into equilibrium and make the simulation under climate change for long-term climate change into a transient state, and then extracted the most productive traits and plant functional types. To then rerun some of the simulations in 4 different setups. And so the high diverse mixed forest would be where you would allow all PFTs that can establish at the site with their full trait diversity. In the second one, you would allow full trait diversity, but only for broad-leaved trees. And then he tested 2 settings where we have we allow needle-leaved and deciduous PFTs. But in each group, only the best adapted strategies, and then the same thing only for the broad-leaved forest. Why did we do that? Because there's a discussion, and foresters ask us, so can you tell us what are the climate resilient, most ideal species, and can I plant them right now, and then I am on the safe side in the future? So we were thinking like, this is a neat idea. Let us do this and run long-term simulations until the year 2600, so that we have several generations of forest and can check the forest adaptation. And so we could look at the effect of diversity, of those diversity experiments on biomass, how the trait, what would be the trait shifts and the other underlying mechanism, and what would be the aspects of diversity. And so again, we did this for selected sites, but now we took slightly different sites to cover a bit of a climate space and also different composition. So we now included also a boreal flatland site in Finland. We know that most of these sites today are heavily managed, but still giving an insight into what could be a chance of restructuring. And now the big finding and surprise is that let nature do what it knows best and forest biomass will be highest. So this sounds like a big slogan, but let us dive into the 3 different climate warming examples. Is that the winner is the green box plot, and this is the high diverse mixed forest or the high diversity experiment. So under high diversity and RCP 2.6, we have an increase of biomass of 18.2% in comparison to the climate adapted forest that only has broad-leaved trees. Each point here is a representation of forest patches simulated across all sites that you saw on the previous map. the two high diverse broadleaf forest or mixed forest, they take sort of an intermediate thing. Under RCP 4.5, the difference is a bit smaller between the red and the blue, the green box plot, I'm sorry. And the gain of the biomass is increasing. There are different factors, but what I want to point you to is under RCP 8.5, the supporting function of biodiversity in mitigating climate change impacts is diminishing. So not only is the difference between the two experiments different, also the change in biomass is decreasing. So what are the mechanisms? And that's a bit of a complicated chart, but I walk you through. So if you assume you have a high diversity, you have lower similarity. And so you see that you have lower competition in the understory, which has an effect on the number of trees. And so you see this in the difference on the number of trees. With this reduced competition, you can actually fill the space in the wood density much better, where there are some strategies that cannot occupy in the low diversity. So wood density is different in the early ages. This continues and dominates the pattern when trees get older. There you have higher diversity, higher wood density and higher diversity compared to the low diversity. And also you see a difference in the mortality. So mortality is reduced because they are locally better adapted. And with lower mortality and higher trees, you end up with higher vegetation carbon. So let me conclude. Give high diverse forests a chance could be a good conclusion in a nutshell. But what we found is that under climate change, importance of functional diversity, functional and structural traits remain relatively unchanged. There are differences between the understory and the canopy trees, and it is the same pattern across different climate scenarios. Locally adapted tree composition emerges and occupies ecological niches in the canopy, so this is very important. High diversity forests can increase biomass storage under climate change, which is a good message for our protected areas. Planting only climate resilient trees ignores positive effect of coexistence and competition in forest gap models. Please note, biomass increase of high diverse forests is limited under RCP 8.5, so the buffering effect of biodiversity could start to crumble. And there, also let me use one more minute and go back to this figure. This figure ignores any of the forestry history that you might find in other managed areas. We still need to work on some of the mechanisms that Tom described already related to drought-related tree mortality that is happening under extreme events. But also, so this could make this pattern look less positive. But on the other hand, if we include below ground competition, so considering more deep-rooted versus flat-rooted trees, this could again compensate it. All of this applies to natural forests without human interference. And with that, I would like to close and hand over to you, Ana.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. So thanks to all the speakers. These were really interesting talks, and I think there were several points where we can link things. So maybe first I will ask one question that was pasted in the chat a while ago for Tom. And then I know Gabi Hegel also has a question, and if we have time, I would at least also have some. And please, for the participants, type your questions in the chat, and we will ask them. So Tali Musavi was asking, what is the effect of age heterogeneity in overall tree mortality of forests, and whether the edge density of the forests influences tree mortality in response to extreme events? And is this included in the models or not? So there are 3 questions in one.
Okay, so I'm going to take the last one. You might have to remind me of the first one, Anna, when it comes to it. So I'm in the real world, yeah, being on the edge, we know that this puts the trees in quite a different microclimate, and this can certainly influence their mortality rates. Are we representing this in models yet? At least in our model and the ones I'm familiar with, no. We're quite some way from capturing that kind of effect, primarily because we don't simulate landscape structure usually. Because the models are large scale, then we aggregate landscape structure into units of similar types. So then you don't have the edge density, but in principle it could be represented. I mean, you just need to separate your forest into those trees that are on the edge and those that are, not on the edge, and parameterize their responses differently. So yeah, there's potential to do it, but we're not at the moment. What were the other questions? 3 in one go, sorry.
Yeah, so does the edge density of the forest influence tree mortality in response to extreme events,
Okay.
and the effect of age heterogeneity?
Yeah, okay. I think this is, I don't think even in the observations there's really clear answers to this. I mean, I'm going to interpret age heterogeneity as size heterogeneity, which maybe was the intention and maybe wasn't. But if we look at different sizes of trees, we know, for instance, in some cases, large trees are more affected by, for instance, drought events, and in some cases less, and that's because sometimes they have deep roots and can access deeper water, and in some cases, it's just the fact that they have to transport water to a greater height in order to transpire that acts against them. And similar things for small trees. Sometimes they benefit from shading, and sometimes the fact that their roots don't go so deep is not a benefit. So it's really complex and dependent on the particular situation and mixture of kind of microhabitats and species that you have in a given forest. So I'm quite confident that if we dig into these simulations, we will see effects, but whether they really replicate what happens in that particular location, well, we haven't unpicked that yet. So much fun things to do.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so maybe Kirsten can also comment, because she had some slides going in this direction, and this also links to a question of Nilka, who has a question on whether you looked at subgroups in the upper forest layer so if you kind of distinguish their individual social status.
Yeah, I don't know. So what we looked at when we looked at the variable importance, we distinguished the trees according to their height. And then we grouped them all together and did not further analysis of the subgroups. Regarding the edge effects, I think it's very often really a microclimate effect of these feedbacks, that drought conditions are much severe because the radiation is much stronger because there's less shading along the forest edges. That can increase the tree mortality. So very often we cannot really reproduce this because we would need a small land surface model simulating those specific feedbacks. I don't know if that answers the question. If not, just type a follow-up question, please.
All right, thank you very much. So maybe I would have a question for everybody to comment on. So you've shown how structure, diversity matter to simulate mortality on the one hand, and then also to simulate resilience. And Chantelle also touched upon the fact that to attribute changes in fire or burned area specifically, you also need to consider management, because management has such an important effect in all of these factors. So Tom, you showed us initializing the forest structure could help us to, maybe constrain better future simulations. But how do you three see the developments on simulating management as well in relationship with, the different topics that you covered today? I don't know who wants to start.
I could take a first pass. We're also spending quite a lot of effort right now trying to replicate management in Europe, and the really awkward thing about it is that if you look into the data, management, you can have like classic yield table type rules for how management might be carried out, and even in places like Scandinavia, that's not actually how management is really manifested in the data on the ground. So, managers interpret or manage their forests according to a whole range of different things, and it's never the simple kind of productivity optimality that controls everything, it seems. So it's really a challenge then to represent management across Europe, and this has been a real issue when we've been trying to initialize. We started initializing based on age data, and then you just you initialize your forest. If it's 80 years old, you planted 80 years ago and let it grow. And that's all very well, but then if it was thinned or not thinned, that makes a huge difference to the biomass you have now. And there's no really good way to do that because we know what the management is now maybe, but we don't know what it was 50 years ago. So what we've moved towards is really trying to initialize tree sizes and size structure specifically from ground-based observations. So at least the legacy of management in the vegetation, we don't need to worry about simulating what happened in the past, because we can initialize from what it's actually the outcome of that past management was. But when it comes to the soils, then it's a massive problem. If you want to look at like the soil carbon effects and the whole carbon sink, then we really do need to know what that previous management was, or we need a massive step change in the information on soils that's available. And if anybody has a solution for that, I would be dancing with joy to hear it, actually.
Right, thanks.
Yeah, I can fully agree. And I think Tom raised a very important point at the end of his answer. I would just like to continue, is that in our analysis, we very often underestimate the importance of soil or soils in general. And for that, we need the deadwood, because that is the new input to form the humus layer and the carbon storage. And it's home to, I don't know, a huge microbiome and a number of species that we can't even really name very often. I mean, of course, taxonomists specialize in this area if they can, but this is something where the models approximated with their functions to build up of the soil carbon. But this is also very important, and models are increasingly good at representing this. Is the more carbon you have, the better your water holding capacity it is, and also has an influence on the nutrient cycling. And so we are also getting better in representing this. But this is also important, and think also for the management to keep this in mind, is that very often it can also, even a deadlock on the ground can be a little microhabitat, saving moisture and providing the little microhabitat suitable for some saplings to grow and establish. And this can be very important. And people who cleared the forest after the droughts and planted them in the open field and did that in the second year, most of the saplings died, but those that could freely establish close to an old log did fine. And so, yeah, it's a complicated issue, but we need to see all the management factors in connection to the below ground processes. And very often, also in terms of fire intensity, From the past fire events that we saw that had highest fire severity, still nature is able to recover, and it did not really accelerate fire spread. So we can be a bit more relaxed, but watch carefully in terms of the connection to the other disturbances like other calamities and fire risk.
Thanks. Chantelle, do you want to comment on management and fire attribution?
Yeah, so I agree definitely with what Kirsten said, and I think management of forests and fuels is definitely fundamental to what we see as changing risks in fire. So providing the fuels for the fire, so it's the management of the forests, but it's also the management of the fire that's really important as well, to say how that risk is changing, whether there are preventative measures preventing fire spread, and how we can model that. And so that there's management in two different ways there, but also thinking about peatlands as well, which can be very high risk for fires, and how they're managed going forwards. So this is also important for the question of climate mitigation. So if we're thinking about reforestation in the future, how are fire risks going to affect those decisions? And yeah, it's very complicated, especially I think the big challenge is trying to represent these very regional decisions and responses in global scale models. So I think we're just at the early stages of trying to answer those questions, but there are some interesting there's some interesting work coming out of thinking about Perkins at King's. He's been looking at a human agency model called WAM to try and model sort of decision-making processes around land management and how that affects fires. So I think, yes, plenty of work to do in this area.
Thank you all. Gabi Hegel, you had a question. So Gabi is the lead of the high-risk events activity. So if you also want to say something about it, Gabi, go ahead.
Co-lead. These were really nice presentations. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. I have a left field question for Thomas that probably is a kind of a regional question, and a small one for Chantelle, if I may. So Thomas, we had in Scotland, in the east of Scotland, we had very severe easterly storms recently, which did huge amounts of damage, because that's not what the trees expect, or what the trees are adapted to. And I think Ana probably knows if there was some early indications that there might be a climate change contribution to the severity of those storms. Is there a way? Is that an important factor outside of very far Western Europe? And do you think it needs to be included?
In which aspect you mean these
So
kind of unexpected...
the wind direction, so not just the storms. And I really enjoyed had the storms in it, but the wind direction for us matters hugely. Also for other ecosystems like wildlife, we lost the whole seal, a whole seal breeding population on the East Beaches and stuff. Is that part of the? Is that included in what you looked at, or is it just the wind strength?
It's been part of our discussions, and we decided in these kind of first steps that we were just going to focus on the predominant westerly wind direction of the storms. The challenge is that we don't generally resolve the topography at the high resolution that's necessary in order to separate out the hill slopes. So we'd have to do some extra work to kind of at the subgrid cell level of these models to pick that out. But I think it's really interesting what you bring up, and it kind of there's so many aspects like this, that these really big events happen because something quite unexpected happened. Like you had a really heavy rainstorm, heavy rainfall at the same time, and it was on an area that had soils that were particularly susceptible to it. And one of the challenges that we do have is we're really lacking enough statistics to draw reliable functions out that capture all of these complex components. So we can construct our model, but then we don't know how to parameterize our model. So yeah.
Yeah, so thanks, Tom. I think this actually raises this question of observations that we didn't touch upon here so much, but it's, I mean, it's also part of the discussions in WCRP, right? How to best use observations. And there's also a lot of work in the community. Tom mentioned Cornelius Infants. He's collecting high resolution data on forest disturbances for the whole of Europe, at least. So you also need this very high resolution to map some of these small scale effects. But I think we're getting there. I think the presentations today were very kind of motivating in the sense that there's progress and exciting results coming out. So I have one last question from the audience before we close, and I think it's actually perfect for this topic because it links to cascading effects and multi-hazards. So Fabian Hackelmann was asking, well, wanting to hear your thoughts on multi-hazards, storms, drought, fires, and other calamities and their cascading impacts. And then if you also want to comment on their relation to different management approaches. I mean, the deadwood, Kirsten already mentioned this partly, but so if you want to talk a bit more on this cascading effects, would be, I think, a great way to close the webinar for today. Kirsten, you want to start?
Yeah, I think the risk is really the cascading effects of, say, you have a drought and a heat wave, and that really accelerates the fire risk and if a fire breaks out, the fire severity is really high because very often in these extreme events, you also have strong hot winds that is accelerating fire spread, and so easily it goes into the ground. So this is some cascading stuff we really have to be careful. And so I think I can only call on the public to be really careful because don't forget, 80 to 90% of the fires are human caused. So we have a hand in reducing the fire risk when these conditions are so dangerous. Because most of those fires are ignited close to settlements, along transportation routes, close to leisure activities. And so it's not just coming out of nowhere. So this is in areas where we have, say, high population density, where we have loads of managed areas. This is not to be compared with the extreme events, fire events that we have seen in Canada, in Australia, part of California. They were connected to high lightning events, and then there's very little impact influence you have in terms of firefighting. So these mega fires, they burned really for weeks. So knowing that, my thought would be that knowing that we have most of the fires close to settlements, along transportation routes, do fuel management along this to reduce the fire risk. Against previous thoughts that fire or storms are connected because of the dead biomass that is produced, I would say it meta-analysis has proven otherwise. In a study covered many years ago, and also the same with the calamities. When you have any disturbance producing a lot of dead wood, will it increase fire risk or impact? And it didn't. We still need to understand the reasons behind it. So this was a database study, but that doesn't mean we are safe under future climate conditions. So I don't know what the others think about it.
Yeah, I quickly can comment on that. I guess I definitely agree with everything Kirsten said. She's covered it very well in terms of the cascading risks on fire. I just wanted to also note that I think the community tend to be moving towards compound events now as well, which I think is a really good way of thinking about these multiple hazards that can occur at the same time and contribute to each other, like heat waves, droughts, contributing to fires, and then cascading risks from that, where after a fire you might get increased runoff, and therefore that could lead to a devastating flood effect event that we've seen in some regions. So yeah, thinking about it in terms of compound events can be helpful as well.
I guess I could bring in one final aspect, thinking about a cascading event that's very common in Central and Northern Europe, which is you have a big wind throw and then a bark beetle outbreak that follows in spruce forests. And of course, the way that people deal with that, as mentioned in the question, is management, right? You remove the dead wood as soon as possible so you don't have the outbreak. But I was thinking about this in relation to something, Kirsten, that you were saying earlier about how the dead wood actually is very important for the re-establishment, and it creates these micro-environments. And if we're thinking about this in the context also of nature-based solutions and natural re-establishment, there's really some interesting interactions here also to explore going into the future.
All right. So I think we have to wrap up. We're past 6:30 my local time. But so thanks everyone for the questions. Thanks for the speakers. As I said before, I think these were all very exciting and also motivating presentations, right? That there's lots of nice progress being done and lots of cool questions that are coming up. I would close the webinar by advertising a next webinar of WCRP on the tipping points activity. So there will be a seminar on interactions and cascades of climate tipping points on June 19. I paste the link in the chat in case some of you are interested. And well, we look forward to discussing again in some other venue. Thanks, everyone.